Today, our first talk of the 2023 Evolutionary Medicine and Public Health Seminar Series kicks off with a bang. I'd like to introduce Professor Carl Zimmer, who is an acclaimed science writer and columnist for the New York Times, as well as the author of 14 books. It was when I was an undergraduate that I first read one of his earlier books called Evolution, the Triumph of an Idea, which really left a huge impression on me and really helped me to understand Darwin's theory properly. His latest book, titled Life's Edge, The Search for What It Means to Be Alive, really goes deep into understanding, well, what it means to be alive. And it is also a compelling read. But today, Carl is going to talk about the evolution of SARS-CoV-2 during the pandemic and the challenges of reporting about it. Over to you.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to talk to you all. I'm really looking forward to sharing with you some of my experiences having to do with evolution and with journalism and with the pandemic that's affected all our lives. I'm going to just move ahead with my slides here. And, Paul, if there's any problem with them, just let me know and we can fix along the way, but hopefully we'll have a smooth ride. So one of my roles is as it's there because the name of my column is Matter. So I write about a wide range of things. Here, just a sampling of things right before the pandemic hit. An extinct parrot. But in any case, while these things are very disparate, they have certain things in common. Obviously, they all are or were alive. And they're all a product of evolution. And actually, nothing in biology, as Theodosius Jebjanski said, makes sense except in the light of evolution. And so I really try to stress that in all the things that I'm writing. When you're looking at something strange in nature, it might be an adaptation that's shaped by natural selection, and that's how scientists try to understand it, to make sense of it, to understand its history. Scientists look at evolution, at life as having evolved into different species, like branches on a tree, like Charles Darwin showed here. So all those things, obviously inform everything I'm writing about. And that's true not just for the articles I write, but for the books. And so Paul mentioned Life's Edge and Evolution, the Triumph of an Idea. I've written a number of other books over the years on all sorts of different things. Some of them are explicitly about evolution, like I've written a couple of textbooks, but then other things, everything from viruses to brains and whales with legs, they all make sense if you think about them as having evolved as well. So, my work, well, everyone's life changed with this particular piece of news back in January 2020. And for me as a science writer, it changed a lot because suddenly there was a global story about a new virus. And so, many colleagues of mine joined the effort at the science desk at the New York Times and the health desk, and I pitched in as well. So writing about viruses was not something that was new to me, and I had brought that sort of perspective of evolution to the challenge, the whole time. And so, this is from way back in 2012 when, we had another pandemic flu in 2009, H1N1, and there were these very concerning bird flu strains. And the question was, well, when are they going to jump over? Will they jump over? We're still looking at bird flu today. That's why the price of eggs is very expensive in the United States. I don't know how they are in the UK. But in any case, this is like an ongoing issue, and it just doesn't make sense unless you think about these viruses in terms of their evolution, their jump from host to host, and the adaptations that requires. The same is true for HIV, and by understanding the phylogeny, the evolutionary tree of a virus like HIV, you can actually understand that transition from host to host. This is a tree showing how HIV has not jumped once from primates, but numerous times. This has happened again and again and again. And this is happening because of ecology, because of economic factors and political factors, because of the history of colonialism in Africa. All sorts of things give rise to this tree. And even when you look at the age of the oldest HIV strains that have been recovered in different parts of Africa where HIV first originated, you can see that they actually follow rivers and train lines. In other words, the transportation networks that humans set up, because once the virus got into hunters who were hunting primates, it then spread, taking advantage of 20th century transportation infrastructure. Now, HIV probably started jumping into humans well over 100 years ago, but in the past 20 years or so, we have actually seen this happen again in some very striking examples. And so SARS was a coronavirus, which jumped over from wildlife into humans in China in 2002, 2003. And you can, to understand the evolution of that new disease, again, sounding like a broken record, you have to understand the evolution of it, and that evolution makes sense in the ecology. Coronaviruses are very abundant in bats and other wild mammals, and then they can spill over. So in the top here, you see them spilling over into palm civets or other mammals, which then passed on SARS-CoV to humans. Also, another one called MERS did a similar thing with camels, and then would spill over into humans. Both these cases were relatively limited in the sense that, these are very deadly viruses for humans, but, the deaths have been in the hundreds rather than what we're looking at now in the tens of millions. So, when this virus appeared, my colleagues and I, this is new to us for the first time. And so we were all trying to kind of figure out, well, what stories do we tell about this as the science is happening? And this is a challenge with science journalism. It's different than, say, sports journalism. In sports journalists, they can write about basketball without having to also introduce their readers to the concept of gravity, the concept of velocity, the concept of spin. But science journalists actually have to, along the way, explain a lot of fundamental concepts about the phenomenon they're writing about. So, a virus spreads. Well, how does the virus spread? Well, then you have to get into all sorts of issues of transmission and so on. How does a virus replicate? Well, it's got a genome, and this is actually the genome as it was posted just over 3 years ago now. And so you have to explain, well, how genomes work and how genomes are sequenced and so on before you can even kind of get to why this matters. It mattered to have the genome because then immediately vaccines could start to be designed. But we were also getting to know this virus just in its full state. And this is a beautiful full atom resolution made by Romeo Amaro at University of California, San Diego. And by understanding the structure of the virus, scientists are able to understand how it locks onto our cells by surface proteins, and so opens the door. This was a particularly fun story I did just to kind of give people the full sense of this virus as something out in the real world, not just as a string of letters in a genome. These viruses spread by droplets. And those droplets inside are a stew of all sorts of different molecules. And all of that actually matters a lot to figuring out how this gets from one person to another. So we would write about these basic biology things. We would, of course, write about vaccines. This was a case where science was making, front page news. This is just then this is what we wrote when the earliest results from the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine came out. But also, again, there are these concepts, and these concepts could actually are very challenging to write about. And they're really important because they can be misunderstood. People may think that vaccines provide perfect protection. They don't. That still doesn't mean that they can't save hundreds of thousands of lives. So it's really important for as many people as possible to know, for example, what efficacy really means. And sometimes, writing a story just isn't going to cut it. Sometimes showing it in sort of a graphic way can help. So I was teaming up a lot with the graphics wizards at the Times. This is Keith Collins' work, where this is just the beginning of something where we were trying to convey vaccine efficacy. But, I certainly kind of came into this experience expecting to be also talking about evolution. And I did do that, and I continue to do that, but the direction that evolutionary reporting has taken has gone in directions I certainly did not expect, and that evolutionary biologists certainly did not predict for me. And I'll explain more on that later. So I wanted to begin with to sort of get people, remind people that a new virus is not in and of itself something incredibly weird, because there might actually be literally trillions of species of viruses on Earth. We've only scratched the surface of viral diversity, and I think that is going to be the story of biology for the next century, is really coming to terms with the full diversity of viruses on Earth. They're the most abundant form of life on Earth, and if you were to make a catalog of all the genes on Earth, most of them would belong to viruses. So even mammals have hundreds of thousands of viruses, most of which we have not found yet. So there's a huge capacity for something new to spill over, as we've seen with SARS, as we've seen with MERS, which are just the coronaviruses. And you can put this virus, SARS-CoV-2, on the tree, and that's always a good place to start. How is this virus related to other viruses? That's where all the discussion and understanding of this virus needs to begin with. And so you can see that in this tree, that there are a lot of coronaviruses in bats. This is just a tiny selection of one branch of the coronavirus tree. And you've got all those gray dots are bats. And you got SARS-CoV, which caused SARS, there in blue. You've got SARS-CoV-2, with a couple things from pangolin as well there, just to give a sense of some of the diversity of these viruses. There's actually a lot more. This is leaving out a lot of the diversity. But you can see that this tree has been branching for centuries. And that's just based on the viruses we can see today. I mean, obviously there are lots of virus lineages that just winked out and we don't have access to them. So once SARS-CoV-2 emerged, probably in October, November, December of 2019, and then started spreading. It started spreading in Wuhan, China. It then spread to other parts of China. Then there were reports of it in other places, Thailand, Italy, for example. The United States responded to all of this by banning travel from China. the virus was already in Europe. People from Europe were flying from Europe to the United States. In New York City, when scientists started to sequence the genomes in March 2020 and then look to see how are they related, what's the evolutionary tree that we can draw, this is what they drew. And again and again and again, viruses were basically flying on planes from European airports to New York City. And then in February, people were seeding the city with the virus, and it exploded in a horrific way in early March, filling up hospitals, requiring refrigerated morgues, trucks, and it was a terrible time, one of the worst times the city had ever seen. So this is the story, and so I wrote about this story in the New York Times, showing how, as the headline says, most coronavirus cases came from Europe. Genomes show. One of the challenges of writing about evolution of the pandemic in this era is that it's a highly politicized one. So this was my first experience of having a sitting president comment, if you can call it a comment, on an article of mine where he said, so the fake news New York Times is tracing the coronavirus origins back to Europe, not China. This is a first. I wonder what the failing New York Times got for this one. Are there any named sources? They're recently thrown out of China like dogs and obviously want back in sad. So, this is false on its face. And it's a commentary on where we are, that we have a president who was making comments that are false on their face. I responded. That's one of the virtues of social media, at least for the time being. And I decided, I would actually write a thread just to sort of capture what I was saying in the article about how the virus had indeed originated in China, how it had gotten to Europe, and how most cases in New York seem to be arriving from Europe. I'm not sure how much we trust these impression measurements, but it was certainly another way to talk about evolution during a pandemic. The kind of improvisation that I think many of us journalists were discovering we had to do. So in this would have been December 2020, there was strange news that actually was coming out of the UK, that there was a new form of this virus that had a number of mutations that were not found in other lineages. Up until now, for the most part, the evolution of this virus was incredibly slow. I mean, didn't seem to be any strong natural selection that you could detect. It was just spreading and into these different branches. But here was this thing that was really different. And you can see on this graph, at first we were calling this lineage B117. And this is showing how divergent it was in terms of the mutations it had. And you can see there was a steady divergence early in the pandemic, and then boop, this thing appears. And so at the time, British genome sequencing was working really well, and it was going very strongly. And so it was actually possible to detect this in England first. It may have originated in England, we don't know, but in any case, England was very well prepared to deal with that. And so scientists could dig into this, and this tree shows you here that box is showing you this B117 variant, what we call now alpha. And there are all these mutations in that box there. All these mutations had cropped up without having been detected before on this lineage. So this was a very puzzling thing, and it came to the United States. So then we were looking to the UK to say, like, well, what should we anticipate? And you could see that it had this incredible growth rate compared to other forms of the virus. Same was true in Denmark and Switzerland. So so we wrote about this, and then tried to say, like, okay, like, how do we convey this information? And so Jonathan Coram, who I worked with a lot during the pandemic, he and I started coming up with ways to show this one variant, because of course we thought, well, we just got this one variant to deal with. Trying to show where these mutations are, trying to explain how deletions work and substitutions work. I mean, this is, Jonathan, actually himself put together this 3-dimensional structure using protein data. Kind of astonishing to be able to work with such gifted people. So pretty soon alpha is spreading all over the place. So we tried to show that spread for a while. I mean, after a while it was everywhere, and then there wasn't much point in keeping up with that. And, there's a political dimension to tracking the evolution of something like this. And, in the United States, we had, for a lot of different reasons, our public health system was doing a terrible job of keeping track of variants. And a lot of scientists were really blunt about how we were essentially flying blind. And, with alpha going around and not being sure what it was going to do, that was a pretty disturbing thing. Trying to understand, well, why is, this, remember, this is before vaccines are rolling out. So what is alpha doing that it giving it an advantage? And this horribly complicated diagram here is the basis of a story I wrote in June of 2021. Basically, it looks as if alpha is able to tamp down our immune system. We use interferon as kind of a early alarm system in our noses to stop the virus. So alpha had basically found a way to interfere with that pathway, some scientists are arguing, so that it would have more time to multiply. But, it turned out that we had to adapt that alpha explainer for other variants because we started having other ones like beta and gamma. The WHO was starting to have to use Greek letters for these things. So again and again, we were seeing new variants come up. Some didn't go too far, like beta and gamma. You don't hear about them too much, but others did. Now, along the way, credit where credit's due, the Biden administration responded to this problem with action. They invested a lot of money and set up a lot of systems to do better at sequencing. Took a while to get it going, but it's working well. It started working well within a few months and continues to do so. I'll get back to that in a bit. So, by May, somehow we thought, well, alpha didn't seem to be that much worse than other things. The vaccines were rolling out. And so my colleague, Apurva Mendavili, and I, we wrote like, okay, here's where things stand. But we did note that there was this thing out there that was, called Delta, which was kind of concerning. And of course, if you recall, Delta just surged through over the summer and brought what was then a record numbers of cases. Then that goes away, and of course, everyone says, "Okay, now we're done." But of course, we had to deal in November with Omicron. I was, my family was with my parents. We were celebrating Thanksgiving, and I had to sort of step away from the gathering because there was a story to write, because the WHO had just declared Omicron a new variant of concern. And, Omicron was even more different than the other variants. Omicron had over 50 of these mutations on its lineage, which again seemed just to have been missed until South African and Botswanan researchers who were doing a good job of monitoring until they found it. Again, it doesn't mean it started there. It just means that they were the ones who were doing the hard work of looking for this. So they let the world know about it. Unfortunately, South Africa got penalized by having a travel ban set up. Of course, that didn't stop Omicron. It's hard to imagine what could. This is a tree showing you Omicron related to Gamma, Delta, those other ones I was telling you about. So again, you can see that this was something that was really off on a separate branch for a long time. Really from quite early in the pandemic, had been sort of puttering along and then hit on some kind of evolutionary formula that let it take off. And as you can see here, it's a different way of looking at it from the next strain. You can see how you had alpha, then delta comes in, and then as soon as Omicron shows up, boom, delta is pretty much gone. Alpha is definitely gone. But already you can see that Omicron actually had already split into two pretty big branches, BA1 and BA2. So even when we first discovered Omicron, it had already been evolving. So what was going on? Very rapidly last January, so scientists, they looked at all these mutations and they zeroed in on some key ones that seem to be particularly important for allowing Omicron to do something new and important, that is to evade immunity. Because by now people were being vaccinated or had been infected or both. And so there was a lot of immunity to earlier versions of the virus. So there are antibodies floating around people's bodies that can zero in on an old version of the virus. So if there's a mutation that can enable the virus to escape those antibodies, that's going to be an advantage. But here you have Omicron with like 13 of these mutations all happening. And what's really puzzling was that, taken on their own, these would actually be harmful. They could destabilize this protein, which is the very protein that the virus uses to attach to cells. So somehow these mutations together were able to deliver a big benefit, even if individually they didn't. So this was actually where, to my surprise, I was having to write about epistasis in the New York Times. I was definitely not expecting that working on the pandemic, but this is a phenomenon of epistasis, it appears, that allowed Omicron to gain this huge advantage. But it couldn't do this in just going in a standard way from person to person. A lot of scientists now believe that what happened was that it may have gone into a single person, a person who's immunocompromised, maybe with cancer, maybe with HIV. And instead of being cleared out in a week or two, it's multiplied in them for months. And so you have a different, set of rules for natural selection to play out inside one person. It might be that you could get those 13 mutations and then in that person, and then that virus could then come out and infect others. So that still seems to be, an explanation that a lot of scientists are sticking with. Others have suggested that it might have gone into an animal. It's the evidence there isn't as strong, but it's an open question. We do know that people with cancer and other conditions, they can harbor the virus for months, and when you sample the virus later, they carry lots of mutations, including some of the mutations that have been seen on Omicron. So this is a reasonable explanation. Unfortunately, this meant that Omicron was good at evading the infection, the immunity, from given by vaccines. I should make it clear that this is specifically against infection. Against, preventing severe disease, it's actually continued to be strong, and especially if you got 1 or 2 boosters. but Omicron really sort of changed the discussion about vaccines, because we very quickly were having this virus evolving in response to immunity in a way that people were going to have to reckon with. Now, it was really another surprise about Omicron was that, if people got Omicron, it seemed like a lower percentage of them were ending up in the hospital or dying. Now, that was probably for 2 reasons. One is that vaccination or infection from immunity from infection was sort of putting up a wall so that the infection wouldn't get that far. Also, Omicron appears to be better adapted at infecting the upper airway. It doesn't do so well in the lungs, and that's where severe disease happens. But it very quickly became clear that a lot of people, and unfortunately some journalists, were translating this into Omicron is mild. In other words, it doesn't matter if you get Omicron. And yet, we had a record setting number of cases and a record number of deaths from Omicron. And it's just simple arithmetic. If something is, if the percentage of people who get hospitalized from a variant goes down by 50%, but the number of people who are getting it goes up by 200%, you're going to have more people in the hospital. And so, I tried to sort of convey this as much as I could. And I also tried to give other examples of evolution, because it seemed like people were saying well, of course, Omicron is mild because viruses always become mild. I don't know. I actually ended up trying to trace where this legend came from. It's just not true. And I think one of the most striking examples is the evolution of myxoma virus in rabbits in Australia, which I wrote about last June. It's a really compelling story of actually being able to watch a virus evolving in real time in Australia, where it was released as biological control measure. And it got a little less virulent, but then got more virulent in different ways. So we cannot just say to ourselves, "Oh, COVID's going to be fine." We're not justified. That's wishful thinking. Unfortunately, wishful thinking seems to be pretty widespread. And so in the UK, which had been a leader in variant surveillance, a lot of these systems were just shut down in April. So the UK has gone from being a real leader in this area to being lagging quite far behind. It's also a big problem in other parts of the world, either places who never had the infrastructure or who had the infrastructure and then decided to take it apart. Somehow we decided the pandemic was over. But by September, there was something really interesting to me, which was that, about every 6 months, it seemed like we had been having a new Greek letter showing up and really wreaking havoc. We had Alpha, Beta, and Gamma, and others didn't turn out to be sort of global threats, but then you had Delta, and then you had Omicron. And then, by this fall, we still had Omicron. There was no Pi. What was happening? Well, it seems like Omicron had sort of found this sort of evolutionary formula that was so successful that really, for the time being at least, the most successful new versions of the virus were just new Omicron. And this is a tree showing you these different growth rates of these different branches of the Omicron tree. So, we've become familiar with BA1 and BA2, which started, they're the ones that started things off. They're gray here just because they're everything's being compared against BA5, which actually, as you can see, evolved from these ancestors. So BA5, different branches there started to grow faster, but also you have some of these BA2s that were growing faster, and we just sort of had this alphanumeric soup of things that were growing quickly, largely because they were gaining mutations that let them evade immunity even better than the earlier Omicrons. This is a diagram of that process that Danielle Focosi has been maintaining on Twitter, and it's a magnificent thing. It's crazy, and this is actually a simplified version of it. But the really important thing here is that a couple things are important. One is that as these things evolve, they not only do they make them able to reinfect people or to evade vaccination, but they also have made monoclonal antibodies and treatments like Evusheld useless. And so this is a real, practical demonstration of how evolution is destroying major drugs that have been used in the pandemic. They just don't work. Fortunately, Paxlovid still does. But in terms of sort of basic evolution, what you're seeing here is a lot of convergence, as Danielle indicates here on the title. These BA1s and BA2s kept picking up the same mutations over and over again. I'm going to just sort of wrap up things quickly here because I've been going on quite a bit. But in any case, this is a new paper that kind of shows you that evasion of immunity putting it on a map. This is sort of an abstract representation of just how distant these viruses are becoming from the earlier versions in terms of the immune system's recognition. XBB1 is particularly interesting because it is a recombinant. It is a combination of two earlier viruses. So that's another way to get this diversity. So I am still writing about this. This is still this story is far from over, and this is just something I just wrote just a couple weeks ago about XBB1.5. Sometimes people call this Kraken. Call it what you want. The key thing here is that this recombinant has now actually gained a mutation that actually doesn't just let it evade immunity, but actually is helping it to grab more tightly to cells. And so it looks as if it might be sort of inherently better able to spread. So this is from the UK's latest technical briefing on variants. And you can see XBB1.5, like it's not very common there. It's much more common in the United States. We're up to 43%. But if you look at the growth rate, and this is from the UK, you can see XBB1.5 up there at the top. Just that one extra mutation, basically that one extra mutation I was talking about has put it really a cut above XBB in terms of how quickly it's growing. You can see that Kraken all the way off, almost 40% faster than compared to the BQ1 lineage, which is already an incredible variant. So just to wrap up, these things matter, and these things, the news, it still matters to report this news because, we're still in the pandemic. In the United States, we had about 350,000 deaths from COVID before we had vaccines. Since we've had vaccines, we've had about 750,000 deaths. People are dying in huge numbers, and the evolution of this variant is part of this story, and it's part of the story worldwide. The estimates now are maybe 10, 15 million people who have died, and more people will die. And our way out will probably involve evolution too. This is a story I wrote back in almost a year ago, and it really has not been followed up on as much as I'd like. We need to to see how these variants are evolving and figure out a vaccine that is evolution proof. In other words, that is going to target parts of coronaviruses that can't change a lot, perhaps because they're so vital to how the virus works. And there are some that have gotten good results in animals, but they're pretty much stalled in terms of human tests, and those need to go forward. I've been going on a little too long. I'll just if someone wants to ask me about Neanderthals, I can talk about those. If you have some Neanderthal DNA, that might help you against the virus too. But in any case, I'm just going to zip through here. I just want to thank everybody. I know I've just given you a huge fire hose of stuff, but it's been very much on my mind. And I'm happy to take any questions you have, and I will exit this screen.
Hi, that was amazing. Thank you. Wow, you're right. It was a fire hose, and there's loads of questions coming through. And I just want to say something that I didn't quite realize, but as you're going through all the way you've done this huge public service to document the entire chronology of this pandemic in the whole process of it, I think is really great. Thank you. Right, so some questions. Gabriella Contaridis asks, let me see if I think I can show it on the screen as well. Do you think, can you see that?
Yes.
Do you think that the reaction the world had to South Africa describing Omicron deterred other countries from monitoring or describing the variations publicly? It seems as if public reaction could be a deterrent. What checks and balances were there in place worldwide to encourage countries to report honestly and openly?
Unfortunately, I don't think that there have been measures put in place to encourage that sort of honest and open sharing of data. I mean, the United States, by blocking South Africa, it basically was just, that speaks very loudly, So, and then again, I want to emphasize, the Trump administration, they made a big deal about stopping travel from China as if this was somehow a China virus, as they like to call it. But that's absurd. Everybody can get COVID. And so we ended up having plenty of COVID coming in the United States from Europe. The Biden administration then said to South Africa, oh, you found Omicron? Thank you. You can't come in. Of course, Omicron was already here because it had been circulating for months, and so it was meaningless. And I do think that it did pour some cold water in there. I think that is important, but I would actually say that what's more important is just the basic infrastructure, which is might be kind of boring, but that boring infrastructure matters a lot. And there's a whole network in Africa that's doing their best across Africa now, doing their best to do the sequencing, but their resources are are pretty limited. And even wealthy countries like the UK that can afford to do this stuff have, I guess, decided that they'd rather not. And so there's a little sequencing happening in the UK, but it's a shadow of its former self. So I agree. These travel bans, we're having it again with China. I mean, not a ban usually, but testing or so on. But in any case, I think what's also important is just the boring infrastructure. We just need to be sequencing a lot more and in a lot more countries. I can't hear you, Paula. You may have muted.
Yes, I mean, really, still after all these years, how does understanding the evolution of zoonotic diseases shape the kinds of public health measures that we can introduce to combat them?
Great question. I mean, if you, I think that we are seeing over and over again how the kinds of disturbances of ecosystems that we've been doing very intensively for the past 100 years just provides more and more opportunity for spillovers. Whether it's hunting or logging or so on. This is not just it's not just a conservation biology issue; it's a public health issue, and we really need to reckon with that. There have been some meetings recently where international meetings where that is actually being acknowledged, but we need action on that, or we're going to have more of these happening.
Okay. With more and more spillover events likely to happen, do you think public trust will improve, or will people become more and more apathetic and resistant to taking new vaccines and so on as new viruses, new pandemics come along?
Well, that's a hard question to answer, I think, because the spillover events are maybe stochastic is the right word. Like, I mean, I don't know exactly when they're going to happen, and it's hard to sort of like talk about their frequency and so on. And what happens with public trust, it has a lot to do with how we respond to these spillover events. And there are different models. I would say in the United States there's a lot of bad models to look at, where we're actually like looking at people who are claiming now that they don't trust childhood vaccines more broadly. I mean, it's like we have a very serious problem that has emerged through this pandemic. On the other hand, the experience that Africa has had with Ebola taught, governments, public health experts, and so on. They learned how to deal with Ebola, and Ebola is sort of a recurrent spillover there because it seems to be in some kind of animal, maybe a bat, and somehow it bursts here and there. And so we're looking at a case in Uganda, which was a very serious outbreak, which Uganda handled. It's gone. It's done. They dealt with it. They had the systems in place, and there was that, for the most part, trust in those systems. This is not a rich country, but somehow it managed to deal with a really terrifying virus in a very professional way. So let's hope for more of that.
Okay. What, if anything, would reduce some of the challenges to science journalism that you've mentioned, like having to explain fundamental concepts, or other journalists reporting that Omicron was mild?
I think these challenges are just I don't I don't see these challenges as being easily just sort of waved away. I mean, this is sort of, I think of them as more having to do with human nature, honestly. Like, when Omicron came, I mean, we were all exhausted. We were all tired. We all, just, uh, and there were these vaccines which were demonstrated to be effective. And so, a lot of people were like, okay, well, I want to get on with my life. So they wanted to act as if Omicron was just a cold. So I don't know how you reduce people's feelings like that. I understand them. I think what science journalists just have to do is acknowledge the emotional state of their readers, and help them to just sort of see that the situation is not what they might like it to be. We may be over with the virus, but the virus is not over with us, and that's a depressing message. But that doesn't mean it's not true.
Right. This is from Eric Zhang. From a more than human perspective, does presenting humans as symbionts of microorganisms help to reduce our fear of the virus or the pathogen, or the other way around?
That's interesting. Before the pandemic, I mean, I was writing fairly often about the microbiome. I'm still doing some microbiome writing again, as there's a little more room to write about non-COVID stuff. And from the start, I was really struck by how fascinated readers were with the microbiome. I mean, I find it fascinating, but I consider myself a little weird in a lot of ways. So wow, like people really were excited about it. And Ed Young wrote a wonderful book called "I Contain Multitudes," which really helped introduce the microbiome to a lot of people. There have been other books as well that have been coming out, and so I do think, I mean, I do think that it's useful for people to understand that we are in fact these symbionts. We are these hosts to thousands of species. um but yeah, I don't think the conclusion to draw from that is like, oh, I don't need to be scared of a deadly virus. um we're on the other hand, we do need to sort of manage that fear and to deal with it, understanding our inner ecology. So if you have an infection, you do not want to just blast yourself with antibiotics, especially if you have a viral infection. All you'll end up doing is just killing off a lot of beneficial bacteria, and you might open the door to resistance. C. difficile or something else might show up. Yeah. So I you know, something like COVID or Ebola, it's still bad. I mean, there's no, it's not, they're not nice, no matter how nice the microbiome may be.
Thanks. As a scientist and communicator, how do you decide how far to go on an article? How much of the biomechanics to put in without making it overcomplicated?
That's a continual challenge. I'm having to constantly gauge that. And first of all, you only have so much space. I can't be writing a textbook for a article. I might have 1,000 words sometimes or less. So you have to just figure out, well, what is it I'm trying to say, and what's the simplest way I can say it without doing violence to the facts. And then also just getting feedback. Editors who are themselves not scientists, like that's very valuable. Friends, like if some, if someone in my family says like, cool article, I didn't understand it at all, that's a failure on my part. So, that's how the decision making process works for me.
Great overview. Would love to hear what is known about the contribution of Neanderthal immune genetics to resistance to SARS-CoV-2.
Yeah. So, well, thank you for bringing that up. I was running out of time there, and I thought I'd just cut that off. So, uh, first a little bit about Neanderthals. So, they are our closest extinct relatives. They're a lineage that split off from modern humans, probably 700, 800,000 years ago. They spread into Eurasia. They actually branched off with another group called the Denisovans. And so you have these other humans that are present from Spain all the way across to Tibet, probably even New Guinea. And they were around till at least maybe 40,000 years ago. So when our ancestors expanded out of Africa. They encountered these people. They had sex with them. They had families, and the children were made a part of modern human society. So we inherit, in some cases, Denisovan genes, in some cases, Neanderthal genes, in some cases, both. And people may have just a few 1 or 2% of this ancient DNA that's still in them. It's ancient in the sense it's an extinct branch of humans, but it's different bits in different people. And a big surprise came up that when scientists were looking for DNA that people had that mutations that were more common or less common in people who got very sick, they found that some of them were Neanderthal DNA. In other words, there is a piece of Neanderthal DNA. If you inherit it, you actually are much more at risk of getting severe COVID if you get infected. Likewise, there's another version which would make you much less at risk. So this is fascinating. Why would it be that Neanderthals would have these different responses to a virus that would not exist for another 40, 50,000 years? We don't actually know the answer to that. But there is a whole world of research trying to understand, what was the Neanderthal immune system like? And that's actually like a serious area of work, and it's based on our ability to get DNA out of Neanderthal fossils, which Svante Pabo just won the Nobel Prize for, and very, very much deserved because of this kind of research.
Thank you for an informative presentation. I'd love your thoughts on long COVID. Is this monitored around the world?
Well, so long COVID is, the experience that people have where some symptoms do not resolve quickly, or even after a mild case, people may have brain fog or fatigue or other problems. And there's an estimate I just saw that maybe 60, 70 million people worldwide have long COVID now. That's probably an underestimate, because it's a very difficult phenomenon to monitor, in part because it's difficult for medical researchers to really even conceive of as an entity, as a thing. It can seem like a sort of a constellation of symptoms, and some people have tried to dismiss long COVID as just people, who are just depressed or what have you. That's just not true. I mean, you can see, first of all, one should not be simply dismissing people's actual experiences when you tell them about them. Second of all, there are lots of distinctive immune signatures that you can see in people who are suffering from the certain kinds of long COVID. I think it's going to be a long time before there's really effective treatments for long COVID, and I say that simply based on the fact that lots of viruses can produce long-term symptoms, and so far, the medical community has not done a very good job at even studying them, let alone finding treatments for them. So, so that's yet another reason to continue to take this pandemic seriously. It's just not, you don't want to get COVID. It's very hard not to get COVID, but it's certainly something you don't want to increase your chances of getting.
Thanks for the talk. What are your thoughts on SciComm over social media? For example, Musk and Twitter, fake news, and the astonishing and hateful targeting of public scientists like Dr. Fauci.
Well, I had shown, my one example of my trying to use social media as a science journalist. I think that right now Twitter, Twitter has basically, it seems, Elon Musk seems to be, he's presenting a lot of, his own views on, questioning COVID vaccines and so on. And I d- and I don't I am not engaging much on Twitter right now because it's just, first of all, like, I don't like, it's my it's my content that I had been providing there for free. I choose not to. So I'm trying out other things right now, Mastodon and Post. I don't think any social media is going to be perfect, but there are things that you can do, um, to make them better places to get good information. I As people who provide that information, I don't think we're in a great position to really like shape those platforms. I think that that's other people's jobs.
Why are bats such common spillover animals?
Good question. So first of all, bats may just be the ones that we're really appreciating. Um, just we happen to be looking at bats a lot, and we might be not really getting a realistic picture because we just really are just starting to navigate the virosphere, as scientists call it. It could be that rodents have lots of coronaviruses and other potential spillover ones. Um, whether it's bats or rodents that went out, who knows? There are some interesting things about bats. Because bats are the source of some really worrying diseases like Ebola, probably, and Nipah and SARS and COVID and so on. People have been taking a look at them, and they seem to have this sort of interesting way of managing viruses. People were talking about being a symbiont before. Bats sometimes are quite symbiotic with these viruses. They don't like launch major attacks on them. They kind of like let them do their thing, but just keep them in check. And it's an interesting strategy. Maybe it has something to do with being a flying mammal. I haven't seen a clear connection there, but maybe that has something to do with it. But in any case, and they also fly, which and fly long distances, and so I think that it seems that bats are also, particularly for coronaviruses, they're flying all over the place. They're going into caves. They're hanging out together. So bats are a great reservoir for this combination I was talking about. It looks like in the history of coronaviruses, they get mixed together over and over and over again because one bat will get infected with more than one coronavirus at a time. And then what comes out is kind of a hybrid. So those may be some things that make bats special.
I'm just going to interject myself because it makes me wonder about this narrative about living with the virus. I mean, is that our strategy really is to be more bat-like in terms of how we get on with these viruses in us? Does that make sense?
Well, it would make sense if you could, if you could evolve your immune system, for another 20 million years to get this peculiar kind of way of dealing with them. I think in the meantime, we should just like, bats, it would be, bats should not, we should be like respecting the risk that bats pose. Bats also have many beneficial functions. They're pollinators. They eat lots of insects and so on. So we need to find a way to coexist with bats without picking up their viruses. Shoveling up bat guano for a living, or eating bats, or having wildlife that is in close proximity to bats, that you're raising for a meat trade or so on. Those are all bad things that physically, medically speaking. We think those are things we can control. We can't evolve our way out of this.
Okay, and a final question. Could thawing permafrost contribute to new spillover events, or are the viruses they contain not adapted well enough to modern hosts?
Well, I mean, you can be well enough adapted, I mean, if you can just kind of get a toe, if you're a pathogen, if you can get a toehold in obviously pathogens don't have toes, but like if you can just like gain a little entry into a new host, there is the opportunity for natural selection to take things from there. And it is true that permafrost is melting and is thawing, and it is true that there are a lot of viruses in there and bacteria that were trapped, that were frozen, that are thawing out. I mean, we know them, we see them, and something's like 20,000-30,000 years old. Like we may not have seen this before in a very, very long time. But it is important again to remember that there might be 1 trillion species of viruses on Earth today that are not in permafrost, and hundreds of thousands of mammals alone today that are circulating around. So adding a few extra viruses that happen to survive in permafrost is just it's like spitting in the ocean. It makes for a great Netflix limited series, but I don't see that as our real concern. I see our real concern as the wildlife trade, as deforestation, as monitoring for new pandemics.
That's the end of our questions. Thank you so much. This has been fascinating. It really has. So yes, and what a great start to this year's seminars. Thank you very much. I will applaud you on my own. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. It was a real pleasure.